The sound of a gun hammer clicking back echoed across the dusty main street of St. George, Utah Territory, in 1875. Every soul within earshot froze as if turned to stone, knowing exactly who stood at the other end of that distinctive Colt .45 Elijah, the Phantom Pierce, the most feared gunslinger west of the Mississippi. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath as Elijah's tall, shadow-like figure advanced toward the trembling shopkeeper who'd made the mistake of shorting him on supplies. "I believe you miscounted, sir," Elijah said, his voice unnervingly quiet, almost gentle, despite the gun aimed steadily at the man's chest. The shopkeeper's hands shook violently as he fumbled for more bullets from beneath the counter. "Why, yes, Mr. Pierce, my mistake. Please take an extra box on the house." Elijah's cold blue eyes remained unchanged as he holstered his weapon with the practiced grace that had made him legendary throughout the territories. At 32, his reputation stretched from Texas to Montana, a ghost of a man who appeared when trouble brewed and left only silence in his wake. Some said he'd killed 30 men, others claimed the number was closer to 50. The truth was lost somewhere in the whispers that followed him like faithful dogs. "Much obliged," he replied, tipping his black hat slightly before collecting his supplies and stepping back into the harsh sunlight. The town collectively exhaled when his tall frame disappeared around the corner. Women hurried their children inside, and men pretended they hadn't been cowering moments before. This was life in St. George whenever the Phantom made one of his irregular appearances, a town temporarily paralyzed by fear. What the townsfolk didn't know was that Elijah never planned to stay longer than necessary. St. George was merely a supply point on his endless journey through the frontier. Until today, Amelia Rose had arrived in St. George just 3 days prior, bringing with her the scent of lilacs and Eastern sophistication that seemed wildly out of place in the rugged landscape. At 25, she carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had faced hardship and emerged stronger. Her father's death had left her the unexpected inheritor of a small but promising ranch outside of town, a place she'd never seen until now. As Elijah tied his midnight black stallion outside the saloon, Amelia was attempting to negotiate with Barton, the only carpenter in town. "Miss Rose, I understand your situation, but I simply can't do all that work for what you're offering," Barton explained, barely hiding his condescension. "Mr. Barton, I've researched fair prices extensively before coming west," Amelia responded firmly, her honey-colored hair catching the sunlight as she stood her ground. "What you're asking is highway robbery, and we both know it." A few onlookers gathered, curious about the Eastern woman who spoke with such confidence. Her tailored traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, marked her as an outsider, but her unwavering gaze belonged to someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. "Lady, you clearly don't understand how things work out here," Barton said, his voice rising. "Materials cost more, labor is scarce. If you don't like my price, build it yourself." Elijah had intended to ignore the commotion, but something about the woman's dignified stance against Barton's obvious swindling caught his attention. He'd seen Barton's work mediocre at best and knew the man's reputation for overcharging newcomers. Without intending to intervene, Elijah found himself stepping closer, drawn by a sense of injustice he rarely acknowledged. The small crowd parted instantly, creating a vacuum around him as people scrambled to move away. Barton's face lost all color when he noticed who was approaching. "Mr. Pierce, just handling a business matter here." Amelia turned, noticing for the first time the tall man whose presence had transformed the atmosphere. She'd heard whispers about the infamous gunslinger since her arrival, but had dismissed most of it as frontier exaggeration. "Madam," Elijah nodded slightly, then fixed his penetrating gaze on Barton. "Seems to me you're asking double what Jenkins charged the Wilsons for their barn repairs last month." Barton swallowed hard. "Different kind of work, Mr. Pierce, more complicated." "Is that so?" Elijah's voice remained perfectly level, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Because I rode by the Wilson place yesterday. Fine craftsmanship on that barn. Shame if word got around about inconsistent pricing." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "Perhaps I miscalculated," Barton stammered, turning back to Amelia with newfound respect. "Let me revise those figures, Miss Rose." As Barton hastily rewrote the estimate, Amelia studied the mysterious man who had intervened on her behalf. Unlike the others, she didn't shrink away from his gaze when their eyes met. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That was good of you." 3 simple words, good of you, but they hit Elijah like a physical blow. No one had used that word to describe him in more years than he cared to remember. He felt momentarily disoriented, as though she had spoken in a language he had forgotten. "Just passing by," he muttered, uncomfortable with her gratitude and the strange feeling it evoked. He tipped his hat and turned toward the saloon, suddenly needing a drink more than ever. Amelia watched him go, intrigued by the contradiction between his fearsome reputation and his unexpected intervention. There was something in his eyes, not the coldness everyone whispered about, but something deeper, something wounded. Inside the saloon, Elijah claimed his usual corner table, back to the wall, facing the door, a gunfighter's habit. He ordered whiskey and tried to forget the woman's words. Good. The concept seemed foreign when attached to his name. For 15 years, he'd been called many things: deadly, dangerous, merciless, but good, never that. The whiskey burned a familiar path down his throat, but it did nothing to wash away the memory of Amelia Rose's clear eyes looking directly at him, seeing something no one else bothered to look for anymore. The next morning found Elijah still in town, though he'd planned to ride out at dawn. He told himself he was waiting for a telegram, but the truth was more complicated. For the first time in years, he felt a reluctant curiosity about another human being. Amelia had risen with the sun, already making plans for her inherited property. The Double R Ranch wasn't large, but the land was good, with a creek running through it and enough grazing land for a modest herd. The previous caretaker had let things fall into disrepair after her father's death, but Amelia saw potential where others might see only hard work. She was examining the sagging porch of the main house when the sound of approaching hooves made her turn. To her surprise, Elijah Pierce sat atop his impressive stallion, surveying her property with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Pierce," she greeted him, shading her eyes against the morning sun. He dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. "Miss Rose." An awkward silence stretched between them before he spoke again. "Thought you might need help assessing what needs fixing before Barton starts work." Amelia couldn't hide her surprise. "That's very thoughtful of you." There it was again, that assumption of good intentions that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He almost turned and rode away, but something held him in place. "Just practical," he corrected. "Barton will cut corners if you don't know what to watch for." Amelia smiled, seeing through his gruff explanation. "Well, I would appreciate your expertise, practical as it may be." They walked the property together, Elijah pointing out weaknesses in the barn structure, identifying where water damage had compromised support beams, and suggesting priorities for repair. Amelia listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed her intelligence and quick grasp of unfamiliar concepts. "You know a great deal about construction for a gunfighter," she observed as they examined the windmill. Elijah's face remained impassive, but he answered nonetheless. "Worked as a carpenter's apprentice before the war, built more than I destroyed back then." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. He rarely spoke of his life before becoming the Phantom. "The war changed many things for many people," Amelia said quietly. Elijah looked at her sharply. "You lost someone, my brother, Shiloh." Her voice held old grief, well worn but still present. "And you?" "Everything," he answered simply, then fell silent. By midday, they had completed a thorough assessment of the property. Elijah had expected to feel relief at concluding this strange detour, but instead found himself reluctant to leave. "I appreciate your help immensely," Amelia said as they returned to the main house. "Would you stay for lunch? It's simple fare, but it's the least I can offer." Every instinct honed over 15 dangerous years told Elijah to decline, to mount his horse and ride away from this woman who looked at him like he was a man rather than a legend. But he heard himself accepting before he could reconsider. The meal was indeed simple bread, cheese, and dried fruit, but the conversation flowed with surprising ease. Amelia spoke of growing up in Boston, her father's business ventures that occasionally brought him west, and her decision to claim her inheritance despite everyone's warnings about a woman alone on the frontier. "They said I wouldn't last a month," she laughed, her eyes bright with determination. "I intend to prove them wrong." "Why here?" Elijah found himself asking. "You could have sold the land, stayed east." Amelia considered the question seriously. "After losing my father, nothing felt like home anymore, and I've always been drawn to places where you can see the horizon." She paused. "Besides, in Boston, I was always poor Thomas Rose's daughter after he died. Here I can just be Amelia." Elijah understood that desire for reinvention better than she could know. "Freedom comes at a price out here. So does safety," she countered. "I'd rather live fully than carefully." Her words stayed with him long after he'd ridden away, having spent far more time at the Double R than he'd intended. That night, in his rented room above the saloon, Elijah found himself staring at the ceiling, remembering the way Amelia's eyes crinkled when she smiled, how her hands moved expressively when she spoke of her plans for the ranch. For 15 years, he'd avoided connections, knowing his reputation made him both a target and a danger to anyone associated with him. But Amelia Rose had looked at the phantom and seen Elijah Pierce, instead the man he'd almost forgotten existed. Morning arrived with unwelcome clarity. Elijah knew he should ride out, continue his solitary existence, and leave Amelia to her fresh start. Instead, he found himself returning to the Double R, telling himself he was just checking that Barton hadn't started implementing shortcuts. He arrived to find Amelia facing off against 3 rough-looking men whose horses bore the brand of the neighboring Cross T Ranch. Even from a distance, Elijah could see the confrontation was headed in a dangerous direction. "Miss Rose, you seem to misunderstand," the largest man was saying as Elijah approached silently. "Mr. Turner isn't asking. This land's water rights have been shared with the Cross T for years. We'll continue using your creek." "Actually, Mr. Dawson, I've reviewed the property documents thoroughly," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite being outnumbered. "The water rights belong exclusively to the Double R. While I'm open to discussing a formal arrangement, your cattle won't be using my water without compensation." Dawson stepped closer, towering over her. "Your father understood how things work out here. Shame you don't. Step back." Elijah's quiet command cut through the tension like a knife. All 3 men whirled, hands instinctively moving toward their guns before freezing at the sight of who had spoken. Elijah hadn't drawn his weapon he rarely needed to anymore. His reputation did the work for him. "Pierce," Dawson choked out, his face draining of color. "We're just sorting out a misunderstanding with Miss Rose here." "Sounds resolved to me," Elijah said, moving to stand beside Amelia. "Miss Rose owns the water rights. She's willing to negotiate terms." His cold gaze swept over the men. "That's more than fair." The men exchanged nervous glances, clearly calculating whether their boss's anger would be worse than crossing the phantom. Self-preservation won easily. "We'll let Mr. Turner know your position," Dawson muttered, backing toward his horse. "He'll be in touch." After they'd ridden away, Amelia turned to Elijah with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "That's twice you've appeared just when I needed help. Are you following me, Mr. Pierce?" There was no accusation in her tone, only gentle teasing that caught him off guard. "Came to make sure Barton wasn't cutting corners," he offered lamely. "Of course," she nodded, her expression suggesting she didn't believe him but appreciated the fiction. "Well, since you're here, would you mind looking at something in the barn? There's a support beam that wasn't on our list yesterday, but it looks suspicious to me." This established a pattern that continued over the following weeks. Elijah would find reasons to ride out to the Double R checking on Barton's progress, delivering supplies from town, warning about weather changes, and each visit would somehow extend into hours of work alongside Amelia, followed by shared meals and increasingly personal conversations. The town of St. George watched this development with collective astonishment. The Phantom, who had never stayed in one place for more than a few days, had now been in residence for nearly a month. More shocking still were the changes in his demeanor. While still intimidating, he no longer radiated the lethal menace that had defined him for so long. He spoke more, occasionally even nodded greeting to townsfolk who had previously scurried from his path. "It's that Rose woman," the barber theorized as he trimmed a customer's beard. "Bewitched him somehow. More likely he's protecting his investment," the banker suggested. "Probably loaned her money for those repairs." None of them could conceive of the truth that Elijah Pierce, the man they knew only as a killer, was slowly remembering how to be human again under Amelia's steady gaze. For her part, Amelia found herself looking forward to his visits with increasing anticipation. Beyond his practical help with the ranch, she enjoyed his dry observations, the rare but rewarding smiles she sometimes coaxed from him, and the glimpses of the thoughtful man beneath the fearsome reputation. One evening, as they sat on her newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Amelia asked the question she'd been holding back. "Why did you help me that first day with Barton? You didn't know me." Elijah was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "I don't like bullies," he finally said. "Spent too many years becoming the thing I hated to stand by and watch it happen to someone else." Amelia studied his profile etched against the fading light. "How did it happen? Becoming the phantom?" He stiffened slightly, then consciously relaxed. "If anyone had earned his truth, it was her. Joined the Union Army at 18. Discovered I had a talent for killing." His voice was flat, reciting facts rather than emotions. "After the war, there wasn't much else I knew how to do. Drifted west, took work as a hired gun, built a reputation. The more afraid people were, the less I had to actually shoot them." He paused. "Easier to be feared than to fear." "And now," she asked softly, Elijah turned to her, his blue eyes revealing more vulnerability than she'd ever seen in them. "Now I'm not sure what I am anymore." The confession hung between them, honest and raw. Amelia reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand over his. "I think you're a good man who survived terrible times by becoming what you needed to be," she said. "And now, perhaps, you're becoming what you want to be instead." Later, Elijah would remember this as the moment he understood he was falling in love with Amelia Rose, not just for her beauty or strength, but for her ability to see possibility where he had seen only shadow. Their first kiss came a week later as they worked side by side repairing fence posts. A sudden summer storm had swept in from nowhere, driving them to shelter in the barn, both soaked to the skin and laughing despite themselves. "You look like a drowned cat," Amelia teased, reaching up to brush wet hair from his forehead. The simple touch ignited something that had been building between them for weeks. Elijah caught her wrist gently, his thumb tracing circles on her pulse point. Their eyes met, a question in his, an answer in hers. When their lips finally met, it was with the relief of travelers finding home after a long journey. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as her hands framed his face, her touch reverent and certain. "Amelia," he whispered against her lips, her name a prayer and a promise. That evening changed everything and nothing. They continued working on the ranch together, but now their shared glances carried deeper meaning, their accidental touches lingered longer, and the future began to take shape in their conversations. The town's reaction to their blossoming relationship ranged from disbelief to morbid fascination. Some believed Amelia must be either desperate or deranged to welcome the phantom's attentions. Others speculated that she was using him for protection, a human guard dog for her remote property. None of this mattered to Elijah and Amelia, who found in each other something neither had expected to find in this harsh territory: understanding, acceptance, and the chance to be seen for who they truly were. But peace rarely lasts unchallenged in the West. Richard Turner, owner of the Cross Tea, had been quietly seething over Amelia's refusal to grant free water access. When he learned that the Phantom had apparently aligned himself with the Rose woman, his anger found a focus. Turner was one of the few men in the territory with enough money and influence to pose a genuine threat, even to someone with Elijah's reputation. He began by spreading rumors in town, suggestions that Elijah had forced himself on Amelia, that he was using her land to hide from bounty hunters, that he had killed her father years ago and was now manipulating her out of guilt. Amelia dismissed these rumors with the contempt they deserved, but Elijah recognized the dangerous game Turner was playing. He was trying to isolate them, turn public opinion even further against them before making a more direct move. He won't stop with talk, Elijah warned as they discussed the situation one evening. Turner wants your land, specifically the water, and now he wants me gone too. Amelia's expression hardened with determination. He'll get neither. I've written to an attorney in Salt Lake City to ensure my water rights are ironclad. As for you, her voice softened as she took his hand. You're exactly where you belong. Her confidence warmed him but didn't ease his concern. I've made enemies worse than Turner. Being associated with me puts you in danger. I'm already in danger because of my property and gender, she pointed out practically. At least with you, I have a fighting chance. The confrontation they had been bracing for came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Elijah rode into town for supplies and found himself surrounded by 5 men outside the general store, 3 strangers wearing badges he immediately recognized as fake, and 2 of Turner's hands. Elijah Pierce, the oldest of the supposed lawmen, announced loudly, ensuring everyone on the street could hear. We have warrants for your arrest from Wyoming territory, murder, robbery, and assault. It was a clumsy trap. Elijah had indeed been in Wyoming years ago, but the charges were fabricated. However, the public nature of the confrontation limited his options. If he resisted or killed these men, it would only confirm the town's worst beliefs about him. Show me these warrants, he said calmly, his hands deliberately away from his gun. As the fake marshal fumbled to produce papers, Sheriff Mills, St. George's actual lawman, pushed through the gathering crowd. What's happening here, Pierce? Mills asked, his hand resting cautiously on his own weapon. These gentlemen claim to have warrants from Wyoming, Elijah explained, his voice steady despite the tension. I've asked to see them. Mills examined the offered papers with growing skepticism. These aren't proper judicial documents, he declared after a moment. And none of you are wearing legitimate badges. Who sent you? The would-be bounty hunters exchanged uneasy glances, their plan unraveling. One of Turner's men made the fatal mistake of reaching for his gun. Before anyone else could move, Elijah had drawn and fired, hitting the man's shoulder rather than killing him. The crowd scattered as guns were pulled. Sheriff Mills found himself reluctantly fighting alongside the Phantom against the imposters. When the dust settled, 2 of the fake lawmen were wounded, one of Turner's men was dead, and the others had surrendered. You could have killed them all, Mills observed quietly as they disarmed the survivors. Trying something different these days, Elijah replied, holstering his weapon. Word of the confrontation reached Amelia before Elijah returned to the ranch. She was waiting on the porch, face pale with worry when he rode up. I heard there was shooting in town, she said, rushing to meet him. Are you hurt? Not a scratch, he assured her, dismounting and taking her hands. But Turner's making his move. It'll get worse before it's over. Amelia's eyes flashed with determination. Then we'll face it together. That night, as they lay together in her bed, Elijah made a decision he should have made weeks ago. Marry me, he said softly into the darkness. Amelia raised herself on one elbow to look at him, moonlight silvering her features. Are you asking because of Turner? I'm asking because I love you, he answered simply. Because you saw good in me when I'd forgotten it existed. Because I want to build something that matters, and nothing matters more than you. Her smile was radiant as she leaned down to kiss him. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, I'll marry you, Elijah Pierce. They were married by the town's pastor 2 days later in a small ceremony attended only by Sheriff Mills and his wife. The town's reaction was mixed. Some whispered, it was a tragedy for the educated Eastern woman to throw herself away on a killer, while others romantically suggested she had tamed the notorious gunslinger. Both perspectives missed the truth that Amelia hadn't tamed Elijah, but rather had recognized the humanity in him that others had refused to see, while Elijah hadn't captured Amelia, but had found in her the strength to reclaim his own identity beyond the fearsome persona he'd created. Turner's response to their marriage came swiftly. A week after the ceremony, Elijah awoke in the pre-dawn darkness to the smell of smoke. The barn was ablaze, deliberately set with their horses trapped inside. What followed was a desperate night of fighting fire and saving livestock, followed by days of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Turner had miscalculated, however. rather than driving a wedge between the newlyweds or forcing them to abandon the property. The attack united not just Elijah and Amelia, but brought unexpected support from the town. Sheriff Mills rode out personally to investigate, documenting evidence that pointed clearly to arson. The general store owner extended credit for rebuilding supplies. Even Barton the carpenter arrived with his tools, offering labor at a reduced rate. "Don't mistake me," Barton explained gruffly when Amelia expressed surprise at his appearance. "Still think you're crazy to marry Pierce. But Turner's gone too far, threatening a woman's home. Ain't right." The shift in the town's attitude was subtle but significant. While few would ever be comfortable around the Phantom, they had come to respect Amelia and to recognize that Turner's tactics threatened the community's fragile stability. When Turner realized intimidation wasn't working, he attempted a more direct approach, riding out to the Double R with 10 armed men to make what he called a final generous offer for the property. They found Elijah waiting on the porch, seemingly alone but radiating the deadly calm that had made his reputation. "That's close enough," he called when the riders were still 30 yards out. Turner signaled his men to halt but rode forward a few more paces, confident in his numerical advantage. "Pierce, I'm here to speak with Mrs. Pierce about business matters." "Anything you have to say to my wife, you can say to me," Elijah responded, still seated casually in a rocking chair Amelia had insisted they add to the porch. "Very well." Turner smiled thinly. "I'm offering $15,000 for this property. That's 3 times what it's worth, and my final offer before things become truly unpleasant." "The property isn't for sale at any price," came Amelia's voice as she stepped onto the porch, a rifle held competently in her hands. "And if you're counting odds, Mr. Turner, you should count again." As if on cue, Sheriff Mills and 5 deputies emerged from behind the house and barn, all armed and ready. Behind them stood several townspeople, including Barton and the general store owner, similarly prepared to defend the Double R. Turner's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Pierce." "Actually, it is," Sheriff Mills announced, producing a document from inside his coat. "This is a formal injunction from the territorial judge prohibiting you from approaching this property or harassing the Pierces in any way." He paused significantly. "The judge was particularly interested in those fake marshals you hired. Impersonating law officers carries serious penalties." Faced with legal consequences and unexpected opposition from the town, Turner had no choice but to retreat, his threats rendered hollow by the community's stand against bullying. That evening, as their unexpected allies celebrated with a small gathering at the ranch, Elijah found himself watching Amelia moving among their guests, thanking them with genuine warmth and making everyone feel welcome in their home. Their home. The concept still amazed him daily. Sheriff Mills approached, offering Elijah a drink. "Never thought I'd see the day the Phantom would become a rancher," he observed. "Neither did I," Elijah admitted, accepting the glass. "Turns out there's more ways to be strong than I realized." Mills studied him thoughtfully. "You know, for years people around here have been terrified of you, but watching you with her," he nodded toward Amelia, "makes me wonder how much of the Phantom was real and how much was just shadow." "Both were real," Elijah answered honestly, "but one was who I had to be. The other is who I choose to be." As their guests departed and evening settled over the ranch, Elijah and Amelia stood on their porch, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the first stars appear. "I never expected any of this when I came west," she mused. "My grand plan was simply to prove I could survive on my own." Elijah chuckled, the sound still rare enough to delight her. "And my plan was to pass through town without speaking to anyone." "Thank goodness for Barton's greed," she laughed. "Otherwise, we might never have met." "We would have," he said with unexpected certainty. "Some things are meant to be even for men like me. Especially for men like you," she corrected gently, turning in his arms to face him. "Good men who have lost their way and found it again." There was that word again, good, the one she had used the first day. The word that had cracked the armor around his heart and let light in after so many years of darkness. Elijah Pierce, once known only as the Phantom, lowered his lips to his wife's in the gathering darkness. no longer haunted by his past, but looking forward to their future, a future built not on fear, but on the unexpected foundation of being seen, being known, and being called good by the woman who had changed everything. 2 years later, the double R had doubled in size and prosperity. A healthy son named Thomas, after Amelia's father, had joined their family, bringing new joy to the ranch. The water rights dispute had been formally settled with Turner's successor after the old man suffered a stroke, and Elijah had found an unexpected talent for breeding and training horses. The legend of the Phantom gradually faded, replaced by the reality of Elijah Pierce, rancher, husband, father. Occasionally, travelers would pass through with whispered stories of the deadly gunslinger who had vanished from the territories, never connecting him to the quiet man who now attended church on Sundays and helped organize the town's harvest festival. Only Amelia knew how sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, the memories still haunted him. On those nights, she would hold him close and remind him of who he had become, of the good she had always seen in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected gift of all, not just being loved, but being truly known, shadow and light together, and chosen all the same.